Hello, and welcome to Ethically Speaking, a UCF interdisciplinary series on contemporary moral issues. My name is Steve Kubler, and I'm the organizer of this series, and I'm professor of chemistry and founding associate director of the Center for Ethics at the University of Central Florida. In today's event, Dr. M. Walsh will discuss end-of-life directives and how life-changing events like the onset of dementia can introduce significant ethical issues. Now, before we introduce Dr. Walsh, bit more about our speaker series and how you can participate. Ethically Speaking is organized by the UCF Center for Ethics with my collaborator, Dr. Jonathan Beaver, who's Associate Professor of Ethics and Digital Culture and founding director of the Center for Ethics. We developed Ethically Speaking to promote conversations about challenging issues of our time. We encourage you to visit the center's website at ethicscenter.research.ucf.edu to learn more about our activities and to find out about other speakers in our series. We'd also like to hear your feedback and your ideas for future talks in Ethically Speaking. Ethics connects every facet of our professional and personal lives. The importance of ethics at UCF, I hope, is clear from the long list of inaugural partners who've helped launch this series. All of us in the partnership hope you enjoy discussions in Ethically Speaking, and we hope it cultivates understanding how ethics provides frameworks for making better decisions, particularly when they're competing values. Today's presentation is being recorded, and we'll post a link to the recording on the Center for Ethics website so you can view it again and share it with others. At the end of the presentation, Dr. Walsh will take questions moderated by Dr. Beaver. You submit your questions directly to Dr. Beaver via chat. So now I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Jonathan Beaver, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Kubler. I'm really happy to introduce Dr. M. Walsh. M is a new faculty member, assistant professor of medical ethics, jointly appointed to our College of Medicine and our Department of Philosophy here at UCF. We're really grateful to have her join us today for an engaging talk, and we'll say more about Dr. Walsh as we go along this afternoon.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Beaver. I'll try and share my screen now. Can you all see?
Yes, looks good.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking to you about cognitive transformation, dementia, and advanced directives. In particular, what clinical practice teaches us the moral weight of advanced directives. And this was a paper that I wrote like 6 years ago, and it has been criticized by many people since, and I haven't responded to any of the criticisms, though I have read them all. Well, I think that that's like a good way to go with papers, is to just read all of the criticisms and then let them die. Okay, so the structure of the talk will be, I'm going to introduce the concern, the bioethical principles at play in the concern, and then a few core cases that feature dementia patients that, are involved in the concern. I'm then going to explore what the typical clinical response to these cases is versus the dominant philosophical response to these cases. I'm going to argue in favor of the clinical response and a shift from autonomy to beneficence. I'm then going to explore some potential objections to my proposal, those that have been put down in writing and also just have been made verbally to me. And I'm going to conclude that we should reduce our confidence in the moral weight of advanced directives as a result of my argument. So as I'm sure many of you know, in bioethics, there are 4 principles that govern what we consider to be good treatment in medicine. So the first is we should always prioritize patient autonomy, which is just allowing the patient to self-govern and self-determine their own treatment. We should also practice beneficence, which is acting in the patient's best interest. Medical care should be just, which is that it should be equitable and include fair treatment. And finally, we should do no harm to the patients, which is the principle of non-maleficence. Now, the key question that kind of started my research on dementia is that clinicians and philosophers had very different reactions to what we should do in cases of dementia patients that express a different thing during the early stage of their dementia than they do at the later stage of their dementia. So the key question that kind of guided the beginning of the research is, why is it that clinicians are reluctant to prioritize autonomy over beneficence when philosophers argue that autonomy should take precedence in cases when an individual has dementia? And I'm going to be talking about advanced directives as a kind of extension of autonomy. So it will be good to just lay the foundation as to what they are. So advanced directives are documents that allow individuals to set out directions and preferences for their future medical care in the event that they lose decisional capacity. So traditionally, these are conceived as an extension of an individual's autonomy, because you write the directives when you have full cognitive capacity, with the expectation that they will be followed when you lose decisional capacity. Now, these directives differ across the globe when it comes to strength and moral weight. So in Japan, for instance, well, this was true at the time of writing the paper in 2020, so it might have changed. But at that time in Japan, advanced directives had no legal status. In Norway, there was weak legal status, where physicians should be guided by the documents, but you will not be sued, for instance, if you don't follow an advanced directive. Whereas in the US, in Belgium, and in the Netherlands, there are legally binding documents. That means that physicians must follow your advanced directives, even if your current wishes you express differ wildly from the wishes expressed in the advanced directive, which can and often does happen, particularly in cases where individuals have dementia. So I explore kind of two cases of dementia patients that set up the concern quite nicely. So the first is that of Mrs. Black. So Mrs. Black was 85 years of age when she received a diagnosis of mid-stage dementia. Because of her dementia, she struggled to recall names and faces of family members. She was noted by nurses to be an exceptionally happy woman who took joy in everyday activities, particularly watching birds. However, whilst in care, she developed a serious bacterial infection which needed treatment, otherwise she would die. However, Mrs. Black had an advanced directive stipulating that if she suffered from an illness causing her to be unable to recognize her family members, she would not want life-sustaining treatment. So when sick, her son said that the physician should follow her advanced directive and not treat her for the infection. Mrs. Black died shortly thereafter. The entire medical team reported feeling devastated, which is what is the interesting point with relation to this case. In particular, her nurse. So Mrs. Black's nurse, Lily, surmised when Mrs. Black wrote the advanced directive, she probably did not consider the idea that she could have dementia and still enjoy a good quality of life. The second case I explore is that of Mr. White, who received a diagnosis of early stage dementia at age 65. As the disease progressed rapidly, he was moved to a care facility. 2 months after being moved into care, he received a diagnosis of having an inoperable brain tumor. After this diagnosis, his children updated his living will, where an advanced directive was written that his children should be the attorneys for his personal care. After this, Mr. White's state declined rapidly, and his physician explained to him and his children that without a feeding tube being inserted into his stomach, he would likely die soon as a result of his inability to take water or food by mouth. Now, the physician did ask Mr. White whether or not he wanted the tube to try and elicit an autonomous response from Mr. White. Mr. White gave inconsistent answers regarding whether or not he wanted the feeding tube inserted. His children also had different views on this, which is the interesting part of the case. So his advance directive very vaguely specified that no heroic measures be utilized to save his life. And the son interpreted that as his father wouldn't want the tube. The daughter interpreted that as his father might want the tube. So the physician decided to ask Mr. White one final time if the tube should be inserted, and he got a positive response from Mr. White. So the tube was inserted contrary to the specifications of the advance directive and the son's interpretation of it. So what is interesting, sorry about the motorcycle, it should go soon. So in both of the cases, the physicians express an unwillingness to implement the advance directive if it's contrary to acting in the patient's best interests. Now, this runs contrary to dominant accounts in philosophy of what we ought to do in these cases. And one particular dominant account is that put forward by Ronald Dworkin. So Dworkin argues that advance directives should have decisive moral weight in these cases. So his view is often used to argue in defense of advance directives being legally binding. So in the case of the US, Belgium, the Netherlands. And he makes two arguments as to why he thinks that this should be the case. So the first is the argument from autonomy. Now, Dworkin begins by acknowledging that individuals are allowed to make decisions for themselves, even ones we consider very costly. And he gives the example of the typical medical example of a Jehovah's Witness who refuses a blood transfusion due to religious beliefs. Dworkin says that, yes, this decision is very costly because they will die, but we respect it because we respect autonomous decisions people make for themselves, irrespective of the cost. So why is autonomy so important to us? Dworkin considers two accounts of why we hold autonomy as such a core value in medicine. Firstly, the evidentiary view, and second, the integrity view. So the evidentiary view says that individuals are often the best judges of what is in their best interests. So according to this view, we should not trust dementia patients to make their own decisions because they have lost the cognitive capacity necessary to be the best judges of their own care. However, Dworkin rejects this view of autonomy as inaccurate, and he does so because he identifies that we often make decisions that aren't in our best interests. So I have an example of my own weakness, which is pistachio-filled pastries, but people also have other weaknesses, such as indulging in smoking when you know that smoking is no good for your health. And Dworkin points out that, look, people do not act in their best interests even half of the time. So we can't say that we value autonomy for that reason, because they're really not the best judges of what is in their best interests at least half of the time. So he then considers the integrity view, which says that autonomy is so fundamental as a value because it encourages and protects people's general capacity to lead their lives out of a distinctive sense of their own character. So according to this view, whether or not the severely demented have a right to autonomy hinges on their degree of their general capacity to lead a life out of a sense of character. So Dworkin identifies that individuals in the moderate to severe stage of dementia have compromised mental faculties that makes it unlikely that they will be able to do this, and argues that advance directives should be respected if we endorse this particular view of autonomy, because advance directives represent what kind of life individuals with autonomy want to lead. So the idea is that by writing an advance directive, you're preserving what kind of life you want to lead by specifying it in the document. That's what Dworkin thinks occurs in that process. His second argument is from beneficence. So he argues that even though moderate to severe dementia patients have lost their right to autonomy, they still have rights to beneficence, which is the right, again, to have their own best interests at stake. So he points out that it isn't clear how to act in a dementia patient's best interests, but to do so, he draws a distinction between two kinds of interests, so experiential and critical. So critical interests are fundamental to the overall success of our lives, and experiential interests are concerned with the quality of our experiences. So again, we're back at pistachio pastries, but pistachio eating is a kind of an experience that I value. And another critical value that I have is what profession I have chosen. So he views critical interests, which like influence the overall success of our lives, as being much more worthwhile than experiential interests, such as what we decide to eat, whether or not we're in pain, things like that. So Dworkin argues that dementia patients are only aware of their experiential interests and that these should not take precedence over critical ones. So he describes dementia patients as being ignorant of self, not as an amnesic is, not simply because they cannot identify their past, but more fundamentally because they have no sense of a whole life, a past joined to a future, that could be the object of any evaluation or concern as a whole. They cannot have projects or plans of the kind that leading a critical life requires. They therefore have no contemporary opinions about their own critical interests. So according from his argument from beneficence, we should respect advance directives because they detail a person's critical interests and not merely her experiential ones. And if left to their own devices, dementia patients will naturally prioritize experiential interests over critical ones. And as we've noted, Dworkin thinks that critical interests should take precedence. Now, I point out that Dworkin's account relies on two assumptions that I think are problematic. So the first is that a dementia patient's preferences change due to a degradation in autonomy. The second is that critical interests are more important than experiential interests. So I aim to dispute one by arguing that dementia is a transformative experience that results in changes in preferences, and two, by showing that in the context of moderate to severe dementia, experiential interests actually ought to take priority. So I do this by utilizing L.A. Paul's fantastic little book called Transformative Experience. If you've not read it, you really should, because she's fantastic. So in that book, L.A. Paul argues that some experiences are simply epistemically inaccessible to us until we have experienced them. So that is, we cannot know what they are like before we experience them. And she gives examples of two different kinds of transformative experiences. So the first is trying a new flavor of ice cream, and the second is becoming a parent for the first time. So Paul points out that these experiences are transformative, but in different ways. So tasting new and unusual flavors of ice cream, which is a great hobby in my opinion, is epistemically transformative insofar as you gain new information about your ice cream preferences. But it isn't personally transformative in that it doesn't change every area of your life. Whereas becoming a parent is personally transformative, as it does alter every area of your life. And it also impacts your critical interests. Now, importantly, Paul argues that these two are not mutually exclusive, and her book actually focuses on examples that typically feature both kinds of transformation. So you get new knowledge by having a particular experience, and it also alters your way of being. So she gives two examples of transformations that involve both epistemic and personal aspects. So the first is, imagine that you elect to become a vampire, you choose to be bitten by another vampire. Paul's point is that you have new preferences as a result of this experience. You now enjoy drinking blood and you never did before. I hope you didn't. And you also have new knowledge of like what it's like to not sleep at the times that you used to sleep, etc. And she also explores the case of, imagine that you have a neurochip in your brain that gives you a new sixth sense. I can't remember what the sixth sense is that she describes, but just imagine that you get a new sense that you never had before. That also would give you new knowledge about the world, but also change your way of being. So while Paul uses a variety of wide-ranging cases, she doesn't really touch on cognitive transformation. So I propose that a cognitive transformative experience is one which alters not only your cognitive capacities, but also the way the person thinks about their own preferences, values, and beliefs. So I focus on dementia as a core example, but I think that religious transformation would also fall into this kind of category. And oftentimes, as a clinical ethicist, people write in advanced directives identifying as having one set of particular religious beliefs. They don't update the advanced directive once their religious belief changes. And then we have a problem as to whether or not the advanced directive should be implemented. So I think that the religious transformation point is another really interesting point when it comes to discussing advanced directives. I just don't tackle it in that paper. So I argue along similar lines to Paul and using her account that it is morally problematic to assign a subjective value to an experience like dementia, which is epistemically inaccessible to you from your current standpoint. So in order to do so, I begin by fleshing out the stages of dementia. So both Dworkin and I focus on moderate to severe dementia patients because the cognitive capacities are really impaired. So in early dementia, typically people notice that they're having short-term memory problems and report these to their physicians. So they often say things like they don't feel themselves, they may begin to misplace objects or have problems with orientation. In the moderate stages, there is often an increase in these issues relating to memory loss, movement, and orientation, and the individual may struggle to follow plans and engage in daily activities as normal. And in the severe stages of the condition, they often almost require full-time care because they may go wandering, forget family members. They often have a decrease in energy or an increase in energy, and you're never sure which way it's going to go. There is also a marked impairment in learning ability and communication ability, along with they often exhibit signs of sensory and motory dysfunction. Now, Paul discusses cases where an individual chooses to undergo transformative experience. And so the case of dementia is a little different because people do not elect to have this particular kind of cognitive transformative experience. And there are other differences too. So the preference change is gradual in dementia and is not in the other cases. So for instance, in the case of being a vampire, your changes happen overnight, whereas that's not the case in the case of dementia. Similarly, dementia changes not only what one comes to value, but also the way in which one values it. So oftentimes dementia patients report an altered sense of appreciation. So enjoying new tasks such as art, for instance, whereas they never used to get any satisfaction out of doing art previously, while also noticing that their preferences for things they used to enjoy have decreased. So Wendy Mitchell actually describes this in her book. So she says, "We wouldn't get on now, you and I. Too much time has passed. We are friends who have lost touch, who now lead parallel lives. We like different things. You love the work and bustle of a busy city, whereas some days I lose hours just looking out of a window at the view." Now, some people may say that dementia patients don't necessarily have the cognitive capacities necessary to have a difference in appreciation of the same activities. So people object that in order to qualify as experiencing a change in appreciation, it is really necessary that one's ability to apply facts to one's values has changed. So for example, we can say that I changed my appreciation for meat if I stop eating it for ethical reasons. Now, what is not clear with dementia patients is the extent to which their appreciation for certain values changes, and the extent to which this comes from a failure to use and consider the relevant facts. So I propose that there is an ambiguity at play here, as the dementia patient's preferences may change due to capacity or due to the transformative nature of dementia itself. I actually think it's like both simultaneously, and that's kind of the problem. An analogy I used as to why I think we should take the preferences of dementia patients seriously is the analogy of childbirth. So often before giving birth, women will write down what kind of preferences they have for whether or not they want pain relief during the experience of childbirth. And of course, as we all know, this changes as soon as the childbirth process begins, because the pain affects like every area of their being. So then they revoke their earlier preferences. And even if their mental state is impaired due to the pain, we respect their new preferences. So if they made a demand that they now want pain relief, we respect that. This is not the case with dementia patients who have advanced directives. So they've stipulated what they want, they then change their mind, but because they're not going to go back to a state where they have full cognitive capacity, their new preferences are dismissed. And my point is that actually there's good reasons to take those new preferences seriously. So I argue that we ought to take the newly revealed preferences of the dementia patient seriously if we are interested in acting in their best interests, and that experiential interest may take on a newfound significance due to the transformative experience of dementia. So this, combined with Paul's argument that we should be cautious about projecting our preferences onto future selves, ought to reduce our confidence in the overall effectiveness of advanced directives for dementia patients. Now, several people have objected to my account, so many that I couldn't fit them all on to this presentation. But one of the ones I go into in the paper is that people undergo transformative experiences all the time, and this by itself is not a reason to override their prior commitments. So the person who objected to this said that, you know, if you choose to become a parent, you can't just relinquish your child once you've decided that, you know, they're giving you a headache. And whilst that is frowned upon for social reasons, I pointed out that actually you can do that. You can override your prior commitments, and that also the two cases are not really truly comparable, because one's agency unravels in dementia in a way that it doesn't in the parent case, and also one's appreciation of one's disorder may transform upon having it. So the disability paradox gives us good reason to think that this is the case. So for those of you who don't know, the disability paradox is just the paradox that if asked, so if I asked Jonathan if he'd enjoy living if I chopped his leg off, Jonathan would probably say no, I'm not going to chop Jonathan's leg off. But just imagine that I did end up chopping Jonathan's leg off. He would actually adapt his quality of life reasonably well to having that disability. And so people often adapt to whatever conditions they end up having. And so these cases are not really comparable as a result. Now, the next objection was verbally raised when I gave this talk at Mind Brain Law in Canada. So Thaddeus Metz is a fantastic lawyer, and if you ever have an opportunity to hear him speak, you definitely should, because he gives these kind of like flash presentations, which are really fancy. But Thaddeus was kind of dismayed by my argument, because he said part of my job as a lawyer is suing hospitals for not following advanced directives. So what is a consequence of your argument going to be that I can no longer sue hospitals? And I was like, well, that is a kind of consequence of my argument. I think that hospitals shouldn't be sued as to whether or not they follow advanced directives. Now, Thaddeus was obviously not very happy about this, but whatever floats your boat gets your goat. You can continue to sue hospitals if it really brings you so much joy, but I just think that it should be for egregious reasons and not for whether or not you follow an advanced directive to the T. Okay, so what is the upshot then of my view for the moral weight of advanced directives? So the first is that one ought to be cautious about projecting current preferences onto a future self. So in so doing, I kind of follow Van Frassen's principle about rational policy change. So Frassen said that my current opinion about event E must lie in the range spanned by the possible opinions I may come to have about E at later time T, as far as my present opinion is concerned. And that just relates to Paul's idea that we have to have at least some kind of information as to how the experience is going to transform us, and that is very difficult to have in certain cases, in particularly cases which are like both personally and epistemically transformative. The second is that substituted judgment standards are problematic for patients who have dementia, precisely because they undergo a personal cognitive transformative experience that results in them having fundamentally different values pre-dementia and living with dementia. The third and final principle generated from the framework is that it suggests that the most rational course of action to take is to allow individuals living with dementia to have preference revelations and for medical practitioners to respect these. More so than that, clinicians already appear to be doing so. Like I said at the beginning of the talk, they are very reluctant to follow advanced directives that seem to be clashing with what is in a patient's best interests. So I'm just making a philosophical defense, arguing that so doing is in line with the principle of beneficence. Now, so far, so good. However, the case of Mrs. Black and Mr. White are kind of positive transformation. Well, particularly Mrs. Black, she is happier now she has dementia. But what about cases where people are not happier for having dementia? In fact, they're miserable. And one such case is explored in that of Mr. O'Connor. So Mr. O'Connor was a deeply religious man who believed strongly in the sanctity of life. And he declared always before getting dementia that he would always want life-saving measures. But he gets dementia and then loses his wife. And after both of these events, continually reports he does not want to go on living. Now, assuming he has an AD written to the contrary and gets sick, should we give him life-sustaining treatment? So my account suggests no, that we must respect his negative transformation, even if it goes against his values in the sanctity of life, because he has new preferences as a result of his experience living with dementia. Now, Earp et al. Raises probably the strongest objection to my account that I found, though there's probably more that I've just like not looked at. But Brian and his colleagues conducted several studies with lay people, asking them whether or not they agreed with me, which they didn't agree with me. Boo, I know. But my account is robust across different types of transformation, so both positive and negative, but also across different types of advanced directives, so treatment or withhold. And what Earp et al. Found was that other factors appear to influence whether or not advanced directives should be implemented. So they found that all else being equal, participants more strongly judged that a clinician should follow an advance directive when it instructs treatment compared to withholding treatment. And when the transformation is positive, participants prefer treat over withhold. And when it is negative, the difference is much smaller. So to conclude, the crux of my argument has been that we should reduce our confidence in advance directives having decisive moral weight. But as noted, the strongest objection to my account notes that I do not differentiate between types of advance directives or types of transformation, and I probably should have done this, but didn't. What can you do? Thanks so much for listening, and I really look forward to answering your questions.
Thanks, Dr. Walsh. That was really fun. I like the boo, what can I do? It feels like in projects like this, there's always more to say. There's always more to the argument.
Exactly. Yeah. And I feel like so many people have been like, I agree, I disagree. That now Ian, my supervisor who really helped me with this paper, he was like, are you ever going to respond to these people that agree or disagree? I was like, I feel like they're just arguing amongst themselves at the minute. And I feel like they're doing a great job. So I'm just going to leave them to do that.
Yeah, I don't know what I would do either. I'm really impressed that you've got some responses on the empirical side too. Somebody was like, that's an interesting argument. Let's see what people think.
Yeah, no, I was really interested to see. I mean, I knew in my heart that like not everyone was going to agree with my argument, but I still think that the results of those studies were really interesting to see what they did agree with and what they didn't. Because people have these documents and oftentimes they don't think about updating the documents either. So we will see people just write an advance directive at age 20, say, their whole life changes, their religious beliefs change, their personal preferences change, but they don't update the directive. And then clinicians are arguing about what should be done about it. So
so Dr. Walsh, we have a couple of questions on the sort of on the autonomy side, and I have one for you more on the ontological side. But I want to turn first to Dr. Janine Vayu for a question. And Janine, if you're here, feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Oh, and thank you. That was really a really compelling talk. Got me thinking about a lot of things. I really think the turn to beneficence and the possible changes in preferences that people living with dementia may develop through transformative experience. I find your argument very persuasive, and I think it's most persuasive if it's true that the patient's preferences and best interests are being met, or that responsiveness. My question would be about the risk, though, of clinicians, carers, and family members' preferences getting confused with the patient's in that process. So what if, for example, a clinician is religiously or morally influenced in their diagnosis of a patient's preference or best interest, for example?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And thanks for coming, Janine. You're the best. So I mean, this is a fantastic question because this happens all of the time. So as in the case of Mr. White, like family members often disagree as to the best course of care, even when individuals have advance directives. But I like your point about clinicians having particular power in this dynamic too, to influence patients' preferences. So I think that hospitals have a kind of protocol where clinical ethics teams will often meet to discuss these cases where a clinician says one thing, family members say another thing, and the patient says another thing, and all will have their views put forward to the committee. And oftentimes this does involve the patient. If they're so severely demented that they can't communicate anymore, then it might not involve the patient. And I think that those cases can be problematic. But I still like the kind of mosaic medical decision-making model where everyone gets to hear everyone's perspective and a decision is then made as to how to act in their best interest. I think that kind of counteracts the potential power dynamic of like either a family member overriding a patient's preferences or a clinician overriding their preferences. I hope that answers your question.
And sort of on
Yeah.
that same theme, Stephen Hall had a question for you about differences, maybe cultural differences across religious groups. And Stephen, if you want to ask your question, feel free. Stephen, you're still on mute.
muted. Yeah, sorry. Okay, I got it. Sorry. So I wondered if any of the people you interviewed were from the East, Hindus, Buddhists. They have their own preparation for death, it seems to me. Do they have advanced directives in this country? And what about over in the Far East?
I actually don't know the answer to that question because the kind of context I was working with in the time was the Canadian context, which is remarkably similar to the American context. So I haven't run into any papers on how Buddhists, whether or not they respect these documents. My intuition is that they don't, because they take a kind of more holistic view of like, we should just let people have whatever preference revelations that they develop. But I would be very interested to see if that's true or not.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And we've had a couple of sort of practical questions come through. One from Dr. Biazzo. Ian said he can't unmute, so I'll ask his question for him. He asked, given that decisions about end-of-life care might change day to day at a certain point for patients, is there a precedent for setting a threshold? Like how many times in, say, a 10-day span do you have to get consent, under what conditions? And I had a similar sort of parallel practical question.
Yeah, I think I don't have a set number of times where a patient like should report a particular concern. I think if it's repeated multiple times, then it shows that a patient does have a desire for one thing over another, and that's when we should take it seriously and into the kind of decision-making process. If patients are just saying one thing one day and one thing another day, it's less clear that it's an autonomous preference. Whereas I think if it's repeated, it's much easier to take it as a kind of new preference that they've developed with dementia. So I don't have a set number of times they should repeat it, but just that if there's a preference that is repeated sufficiently often that clinicians have noted it, then it should be featuring into the kind of conversations clinical ethicists are having about them.
That makes sense to me, and I can't speak for Ian, but I would guess I would hypothesize that the same thing that bothered me bothered him, and that's the case of Mr. White. It sounded like in that case, the physician asked maybe once, and Mr. White said no, and then circled back around at some later date and asked again, and the patient said yes, and then the physician, it felt like, went with their preference, which is an interesting choice given dementia.
Yeah, no, I think they did that because their reluctance to like withhold treatment when you can give treatment, and that this plays out even in popular opinions of what to do in advanced directives. So that's what I thought was really interesting, is like people really don't like when you withhold treatment, even if it runs contrary to what the patient is expressing. but I agree. I mean, I think that as a medical process, he should have asked and had it repeated in order for it to count as like Mr. White's autonomous decision in that case.
Yeah, it's such an interesting problem, and I think that led me to my own theoretical question. And I wondered if, on your account or others in this space, if to what extent new preferences represented a new person. Because in particular, in the case of dementia,
Yeah.
it seems different to me, feels different to me, having gone through it now a couple of times with family members. It's not the same person in a way that's very distinct from when a family member has a new baby, another transformative experience.
Yeah.
So the sort of consent process changes over time because the person changes over time in a really fundamental way. Is that antithetical to the view in the literature or your view?
No, I mean, that aligns with my view about individuals living with dementia. I think that the problem is that the Dworkinian account really wants to hold them to a person that they no longer are. So like in many cases in clinical ethics, you're trying to explain to a person who no longer identifies with the values that they stipulated in their advance directive. Like, you said that you wanted us to not do this thing, but they're now happy living with dementia. So they're like, why would I have ever said that? I don't like, I can't recall being that person. And yet you're holding me to that person's standard when I now feel and act and I am an entirely different person. This is like unjust. But I think in philosophy, at least, we have prioritized autonomy above everything else and the preservation of autonomy in a way that really doesn't make sense in the case of dementia, because I think that it does change every aspect of your being. So not only your preferences, but the way you are with other people, your energy levels, your communication style, everything changes. So it's not I don't think it's that healthy to hold them to a standard that they can't remember. It often results in a lot of like distress from the patient. You know, you're trying to explain to them that once 10 years ago you said that you didn't want to do this thing and now we're going to do this thing to you. They're like, I don't even recall, like, you know, and yeah.
There's a good chance that I don't have dementia, but I already wouldn't remember what I said 10 years ago. Very
Yeah.
sympathetic to the view.
Yeah.
I'm setting up here a question from Veronica Peterson about sort of a parallel case, but a little different speed, let's say. Veronica, if you're here, if you want to ask your question, feel free.
Hello. Yeah,
Hi.
hi. My grandma was 93 when she died, but she pretty much had the mental capacity of everyday, like a 40-year-old adult. I mean, she had better memory than most people have her age. But the day that she went to the hospital, I found her on the floor and she was confused. She knew who I was, but didn't know any neighbors or friends or anything else that came into to pick her up at the hospital. Now, if anybody asked her at that time, do you have an advance directive, or do you want to have life-saving things for you, her answer would have been different, I think, than possibly what her advance directive is. So it wasn't dementia, but now it's an altered state of mind. I know that it's still an alteration of mind, but I know that happens a lot with people. That happened recently with my stepmom, who had a UTI, and in older adults that changes a lot of their mental capacity. You don't realize that. I'm a nurse, so it does change your mental capacity and what they're thinking.
Yeah.
Being that sick. So how would that play into this kind of field too? Because if they had an advance directive beforehand that said one thing, but now it says another, they're saying something else contrary to that. How's that work?
Yeah, I think that you're picking up on another really important point that I kind of frame cognitive transformation as like a category, but then I don't go into all of the ways in which your mind can alter, and like they can definitely be overnight alterations of the kind that you were talking about that are also really difficult to deal with when it comes to knowing like how and when you should implement an advance directive. So I think like respecting their new preference is important regardless, but that the advance directive should still be guiding. And if a family member thinks that that represents their critical interests, say, that should still be reported to the medical team. So it's still like a guiding document, but that hospitals are not legally bound if they don't follow the advance directive. That would be my view. But like I said, like lawyers were not happy when I was like, I don't think you should not sue hospitals on whether or not they implement advance directives. So
Yeah,
that's my
because the
view,
interesting,
but
yeah, the interesting thing is that her PCP was also her heart doctor, and he was there at the hospital with her. And forever she's kept telling him, I don't want any special stuff happening. I don't want to be, you know, low life-saving support. Then we get to the hospital and he wants to save her life with giving her nutrition. When I said that's opposed to her views in the advance directive. So there was a misconnect with him as well, because one of his long-term patients that he adored, you know, that was contrary to what her. So there's a balance there. That's where I kind of said, And now my dad's going through dementia. So I'm like, you know, I'm very interested in this topic.
yeah, no, I mean, I'm interested too. And I think it is hard, like when physicians like try and override like family members and also what the patient has said. And I think that's why like teams are so important when deciding how to act in these cases, as like kind of a spokesperson for like, no, she has expressed several times that she doesn't want this tube to be fitted and we shouldn't fit this tube actually, irrespective of her mental state, because the repeated wish along with what the family members know is a good indicator, is a strong indicator of her preferences.
Yeah. Dr. Walsh, you're poking at a really fundamental question in medical education too, I would guess, about the extent to which we train physicians that their primary obligation is to provide care. I mean, in some ways you're articulating that their primary obligation to care might be to withhold treatment. And I just think a lot of physicians aren't trained to recognize that. So it feels like they're doing a disservice to a patient. Such a
Yeah, I
tricky
think
point.
Absolutely. Like we often see this too in cases of like physician aid in dying. So like it's very contrary to a care model to think about prematurely like ending someone's life to save them from harm. And that's why so many people like opt out of that
Yeah.
practice in general. It's just, it kind of runs contrary to their values. But I think that it is still important to like, you know, consider that some people are worse off for these experiences. Some people are better off, some people are worse off, and we have to kind of respect their newly developed preferences, at least to the best of our ability.
Well, and that's the thing with the, you know, the doctor knew her preferences, and on top of all this, she would have died 6 months later anyway of colon cancer, because she just didn't want any cancer treatments. So there was that perspective too. It's like she's already, you know, kind of there.
Yeah.
And her preference was this. So
Yeah.
you transforming her now, so, you know, maybe it's helping her not have critical pain going through cancer at the end. So you know, that was the thing we tried to tell him. I said, and you know this doctor because you're her PCP.
Yeah. Dr. Walsh, we have a question
Thank
from
you.
Dr. Kubler about the role of technology. And Steve, you have another question too, so feel free to swing at either one. But I wanted to, before you ask, Steve, I just wanted to point to Dr. Jones' comment, which in the chat, which really has stuck with me already. So, Steve, go ahead.
Well, I don't like to be the person that thinks technology solves every problem, but I've been amazed by how, for instance, our views of animal autonomy or agency have changed as technology has advanced. We now know things about animals' abilities to use tools or to communicate. And so that's changing our sense of how we should treat animals. So in that sense, how would this whole discussion change, and how would the ethical landscape change if technology advances to where we can understand better the state of the demented mind? You know, if we have functional MRI, we can now kind of begin to see images of what people are actually seeing by studying brain patterns, as I understand it. You know, what if we could probe the demented mind with functional MRI and say, well, outwardly they seem agitated, but inside they're actually having a great time. So I don't know where the tech could go, but would that change the arguments, or do you think they're robust against technological development?
No, I don't think any of my arguments are that robust against any of the potential objections. So what I think is interesting is that technology is enabling individuals who have lost the ability to communicate to still express themselves, which I think is a very important advancement in these cases of cognitive transformation, because we often view when people are no longer able to express themselves as like they no longer have a preference for their treatment. They no longer have thoughts in their head. And that's often not true in cases of dementia or in other kinds of cases of cognitive transformation. And I think utilizing these devices to get to like understand the expressions of individuals living with dementia is really important. And I think that's like another value of art therapy in these kinds of cases, or like music therapy or anything which enables them to express themselves. That's not just through words, you know, because if you can no longer use words, then that is not useful for you, and you might still have expressions that you want to get out, but that you no longer have the ability to communicate, and that in and of itself is a frustrating thing. So I will be really interested to see in which the ways technology could help bolster the autonomy of individuals living with dementia, because I think that would be a really important way of preserving their autonomy and also acting in their best interests, like being able to identify what they think and believe still.
Yeah, that's helpful. The second question is pretty short. I'll just throw it out real quick. Does it change anything if a person puts in their advance directive a request to permit them to change their advance directive in the future, no matter their state of mind or being?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is useful in a sense. I mean, I at least think that people should update them regularly, like every few years, because the advanced directives I've seen on clinical ethics committees haven't been updated for a decade. Like, we're not the same people that we were a decade ago, and yet the preferences we hold people to are often like over 10 years old, and oftentimes people have had like religious transformative experiences, personal transformative experiences, all of these kinds of things. And so it would be really useful for clinicians and for medical practitioners in general to have an updated document, and for people to regularly update and be able to update their documents, because the problems arise when they're not regularly updated.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Dr. Kissel, we've got a question from you about other future scenarios and sort of thinking about parallels.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sympathetic to the conclusion, and so I'm just trying to like come up with some problems, so to speak. But what I'm wondering is, is this line of argument that you're presenting here, how do you think, like, do you want to try and box it off just for cases of dementia and advanced directives, or how do you think about it applying to other cases, right? Because I'm thinking, like, we obviously, as you just said, we're all changing over time. What we seem to want now, or think we want now, or we think we're going to want in the future is just like, I don't know how connected those are, but not very much, I imagine. And so one of the things I have in mind is, like, it seems like your view is giving a lot of weight to like what the future me wants, right? So the advanced me in the past wanted X. Now something's changed and I want Y. Okay. And then I wonder, I don't know if it's an unfairness consideration, but like I do all sorts of things to try and set myself up to have a certain sort of life, or for things to go a certain way. And I don't really buy this argument, but it feels a little bit weird that, like, okay, the advanced directive is one way to explain why I'm doing these things, but if I thought that, you know, future me is a totally different person, not totally, but like a quite different person, then maybe I wouldn't have the motivation to do these things, or I wouldn't, maybe I would feel like an unfairness is being done to me or something. And so I was wondering, do you think there's some reason why we should take the present preferences more seriously than the past, given that we do all these things with this like future us in mind?
Yeah, no, I think that that's a great kind of criticism of my account. And I think that Paul Menzel actually wrote a commentary that was along these lines of like, if I really value autonomy above all else, and I've decided that even if I change my mind, I still value autonomy, and like nothing is going to shake that valuing for me, then you are doing an injustice by not respecting like me valuing this right now, by not implementing my advance directive. And you kind of render them useless in a sense, because you're just saying they're a guiding document and they don't hold decisive moral weight. And I think people who really kind of are sympathetic to the Dworkin view of like autonomy should prevail over all else are not that sympathetic to the view that transformative experience should alter whether or not we take these documents as seriously as we do. So I think that that is a good critique of my account, and some people really do hold this view that, you know, even if I suffer in the end, like I still really believe this thing now, and you're being unfair to me if you don't like follow through with that. Like some people really hold that extreme view. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, thank you.
It's interesting that the some people that hold the view are, would you say, Belgium, the Netherlands, and the US, but in other national contexts, they have other views about what that document should do and why.
Yeah.
So such interesting differences.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was always shocked that you know, in the US they are like legally binding, because in some ways it's not as surprising with Belgium and the Netherlands, because they have very porous views on like people should always be able to decide exactly how their life goes. And like in the Netherlands, for instance, you know, even people with severe mental illness can request physician aid in dying, and that's accepted. So like it shocked me more that in the US they're legally binding, but I guess, you know, lawyers have to sue someone, and they have to sue hospitals, and these documents are like one way in which you can sue hospitals. But I don't think that that's really like a good use of lawyers' time, because it's not like any of the clinicians in these cases wanted to harm the patient or wanted to neglect the patient. My point is that they're all trying to understand what the patient wants. And yes, they didn't follow the advance directives, but they're trying to act in their best interests. So they shouldn't be harmed because they're trying to act in the patient's best interests. So I'm more for giving them like weak legal status and using them as a guiding document than like you're bound to this document that you write.
It's a depressing view to think that advance directives in the US just let lawyers make money off of hospitals, increasing healthcare costs for all of us. So on that very dark note, Dr. Walsh, I'll turn things back to Dr. Kubler.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Walsh, for helping us understand some of the moral challenges associated with end-of-life directives. And as always, I thank Dr. Beaver for expertly moderating our discussion, and thank you, our participants, for great questions and engagement. If you haven't, in the next few moments, scroll through some of the comments. There's always good stuff there as well. Recording of this presentation will be made available on the UCF Center for Ethics website, so you can view it again and share it with others. And there you can also find links to past talks. So if you enjoyed this one, check out the ones you missed. Information on upcoming presentations and ethically speaking are there too. Today's event is our last presentation for 2024. So now I'm going to take a moment to share the screen and tell you about our first speaker for the incoming new year. Okay, hopefully that worked. Structural injustice has become a hot button issue, but what is it really? And who ultimately bears responsibility for it? Our next speaker, and I'm going to butcher this name, Dr. Maeve McCowan, I think, draws on case studies ranging from third world sweatshops to global climate change to help us move beyond talk of unintended consequences and blameless participation toward an understanding of how power and responsibility truly function in today's world. And her analysis gives us a more sophisticated sense of how structural injustice operates and what we can do as individuals about it. Dr. McCowan is an assistant professor of political theory at Campus Friesland, an interdisciplinary faculty at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And in addition to being a widely published author, she's an expert in structural injustice, historical injustice, reparations, and feminism. We look forward to welcoming her to Ethically Speaking next time, and I hope you'll visit the UCF Center for Ethics webpage right now and register for Dr. McCowan's presentation. Ethically Speaking is made possible with support from the National Science Foundation and the many UCF partners you see listed here. I'd like to thank them all for helping us bring this series to you. And once again, thank you for your participation, and I hope you'll join us for our next presentation in Ethically Speaking.